Welcome back everybody, my name is Nick930, and to celebrate the release of the new Norse-themed God of War, we're going to be taking a look back at the history of God of War.
My vengeance ends now.
Finally, in 2010, Santa Monica Studio released the much-anticipated finale to the God of War epic, God of War 3. God of War 3 was a massive step forward in almost every department, especially the visual design. Oddly enough, the studio didn't build God of War 3 from the ground up, and instead utilized the same Kinetica game engine used for the first two entries. This allowed the developers the freedom to focus on the game's visuals and creating new content, without having to worry about the game's animations, movement, and raw gameplay. The graphical fidelity was increased substantially thanks to the power of the PlayStation 3, with character models like Kratos going from only 5,000 polygons in older games to 20,000 polygons, in addition to some new texture techniques and shaders that enabled for a much more realistic image. The improvements to the game's visuals also set God of War 3 apart aesthetically from the other entries, with a more realistic color tone and darker appearance. Blood finally appeared realistically, and the game's gory finishers became much more difficult to watch. The game's story takes place immediately after the cliffhanger at the end of God of War 2, with Kratos leading a charge on Mount Olympus to slay Zeus. But soon after defeating Poseidon, Kratos finds himself thrown back into the underworld for probably the 5th time now, I believe, and is forced to seek out the flame of Olympus to defeat Zeus. This adventure has Kratos take down some of the most prominent Greek gods and heroes, including Hades, Hercules, Hermes, Helios, and of course Zeus himself, making it the single most ambitious game in the franchise. The gameplay remains identical to what was in God of War 2, with many of the same moves and combos making a return, and some minor adjustments to the gameplay, including chests now offering both blue and green orbs, and health and power upgrades only requiring 3 collectibles instead of the traditional 6. God of War 3 took the franchise's signature cinematic moments to a new level, with high-fidelity action sequences and incredible spectacles that rival games available today. The game received overwhelmingly positive reviews, with many citing that it sent the series off on a high note. But Sony Santa Monica wasn't done with their Spartan god killer, and the franchise wouldn't die with Zeus. Releasing soon after God of War 3, Ghost of Sparta was another prequel game previously only available for the PlayStation Portable device. Ghost of Sparta's plotline was originally planned to be the plot of God of War 2, and sees Kratos looking for his long-lost brother Deimos in the Domain of Death. In flashbacks featured throughout the game, it's revealed that when Kratos and Deimos were children, the gods feared that the destruction of Olympus would be delivered by a marked man, who they believed to be Deimos. Ares kidnaps Deimos, and as Kratos attempts to stop him, Ares gives him the scar over his eye. To honor his kidnapped brother, Kratos tattoos his body with this signature red mark, making him the true marked one that will bring destruction to all of Olympus. The actual gameplay takes place several years later after Kratos becomes the God of War, and sees him seeking out the truth about the fate of his family. The plotline is interesting in Ghost of Sparta, as it gives a lot of cool background information that explains where Kratos got his scar and why he has a huge body tattoo. The story also reunites Kratos with his mother and adds a lot more depth to a character that previously just shouted and killed anything that pissed him off. The gameplay remains the same, with a few minor enhancements like the ability to string together air attacks, and the game itself received critical acclaim, though it's not as highly regarded as other entries. Struggling to find a way to preserve the popular PlayStation mascot after successfully ending the core storyline, Santa Monica revealed God of War Ascension, the first main entry prequel game and the first game in the franchise to offer its own competitive multiplayer mode. God of War Ascension takes place before the events of the first game in the franchise, and shows the events that lead up to Kratos turning against Ares. But to break a vow with a god, Kratos needs to destroy the 3 Furies, who would brutally punish those who truly deserved it. There's a lot of interesting mythology in Ascension that I personally had never heard about, and it was a very interesting, unique storyline that took Kratos to some strange places. But ultimately, the story does little to push the main story forward. Ascension's gameplay and overall game design feels drastically different from the other entries. The game's UI elements have been altered in an attempt to make things like contextual button prompts appear like they belonged in that world. but this made it a bit more difficult to identify as a player. The game's weapons and power system have also been reworked, with Kratos now having the ability to switch seamlessly between different blade types that would affect enemies in different ways. A rage meter had been introduced that fills with each consecutive hit on an enemy and could be activated when filled to unleash a powerful attack. There are also occasional secondary weapons lying on the ground that can be used temporarily to attack enemies, but they were often difficult to use. Enemies in Ascension are relentless, and you often find yourself being hit from multiple directions without a chance to defend yourself. Unlike past games, trying to chain together combos is much more difficult than past entries, as your attacks rarely interrupt enemy attacks, and Kratos' signature blades feel significantly weaker than they usually do. On top of this, the game's fixed camera angles are poorly designed, with many scenes zooming out way too far in an attempt to show the massive scale of some of the set pieces. While the large set pieces are impressive, the camera angles made it even more difficult to focus on the combat, and I often found myself losing track of Kratos during fights. Some of the game's platforming had been enhanced in Ascension, with Kratos now able to climb handholds much like Uncharted or Tomb Raider games, and the game's cinematics seemed to offer more story and character than we had seen in the past. God of War had finally started to evolve, and Ascension, while not the best entry in the franchise, was likely the catalyst for the shift in creative design. But before we move on, we should briefly talk about Ascension's multiplayer. Ascension's multiplayer is designed with a sort of rock, paper, scissors mentality, with various classes featuring different strengths and weaknesses to each other. Players would battle each other with a similar control scheme as the single player on set arenas often backdropped with mythological elements. Unfortunately, the God of War gameplay doesn't really translate very well to multiplayer, and the supposedly thoughtful design devolves quickly into a button-mashing free-for-all with lots of respawning and needless leveling up. God of War Ascension was a definite low point for the God of War franchise, despite earning an 80% on Metacritic, and the franchise would go dormant for several years before we saw the likes of Kratos again. And despite all signs pointing to the death of the franchise, a new entry to the series was announced at E3 2016, showing a much older Kratos and set in an entirely new Norse mythology backdrop. The new God of War aims to change a lot of signature elements to the God of War franchise, doing away with things like the fixed camera angle and the mindless hack-and-slash gameplay. God of War aims to put the player closer to the action and goes for a far more cinematic approach, in line with what we've seen in the reboots to games like Tomb Raider. Kratos appears to have significantly more character this time around, as he trains his son how to survive in this brutal new world. It's still unclear how this game connects to the older games, but we'll have to find out when the game releases this Friday. And that's the history of God of War so far. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos posted like this every week.